Our first ever interview now with the new Minister of Delivery. Grant Robertson announced yesterday that he'd been tasked with heading a new implementation unit responsible for ensuring delivery for the government's priorities. And Grant Robertson's with us. Very good morning.
Morning, Mike.
An acceptance that delivery isn't your strong point?
No, an acceptance that with a very large sum of money going in with COVID-19 and a number of kind of complex cross-departmental projects and programs that we've got, that having a small group of people based out of the Prime Minister's Department who keep an oversight, work with the agencies, work with the ministers to make sure we meet the milestones, I think is important. I think it's best practice as well. Individual agencies still do all of their reporting, all of the things the unit does will still go through the cabinet process, but having that extra set of eyes and helping bring different agencies together, I think is a good thing.
Would it have prevented Kiwi Build?
Kiwi Build's, the challenges with Kiwi Build are well and truly on the record. This is not about preventing particular things happening. It's about making sure that given the significant amount of resources we're putting in a number of these projects where, the one I mentioned yesterday was Jobs for Nature, which is one of the COVID employment programs. It involves about half a dozen different agencies, plus regional councils and local groups and so on. So I think it's timely. I think it's the right thing to do. I noticed Boris Johnson was actually talking about some of this in the UK earlier in the year as well. When you're responding to COVID, you're responding to a crisis, there's big programs in place. It's really just to make sure that all of us are getting value for money and making sure that we're delivering on what we say.
Reported just this week on the infrastructure, some of the jobs you promised, $20,000, 20,000 jobs plus doesn't appear to be the case, more like 11,000 jobs. Is that the sort of thing it would help smooth out or over?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting one because what that was obviously something that happened right in the height of COVID. We announced the in-principle agreement to a set of projects, around 170 at the time, and numbers of jobs were based on the people who had proposed those projects, and that ranges from private sector groups to local government to iwi, to all sorts of people. And so those were their estimates. What we then did was go back and do the due diligence and the contracting, and that saw the number of actual jobs come down. So I'm not sure the unit per se would be about that. That's actually us doing our job properly on behalf of taxpayers to make sure that the contracts are what they say they are. People, when they put their proposals in outside of government, clearly decided that they thought there'd be more jobs than there were.
Would they be more shovel-ready than they've turned out to be?
Yeah, that's an interesting one too, because certainly some of the projects, were a bit further back in the process than would have been ideal, but that's not necessarily all completely the fault of the people who've applied. It's just a question of timing and COVID making a number of processes, consenting and other things a little bit more challenging. But, these are still good projects. They're still important projects in the regions of New Zealand that are going to deliver long-term legacy projects in a number of ways, as well as delivering jobs. The reality is, though, when people put their proposals in, they said this is how many jobs we think it's going to create. We've done our job, the due diligence, the contracting, and the numbers are different.
Couple of things while I've got you. FTA of sorts announced with Australia and UK. How far behind are we?
Yeah, look, we're pushing on with ours. I mean, obviously, we're very much looking at a high-quality agreement here that particularly supports our primary exporters. And every free trade agreement, Mike, that I've had any connection with, New Zealand has always pushed hard to be able to make sure we make a real difference for our people. Obviously, moving into the Europe and UK, we run into particular issues around the way in which those jurisdictions support their primary producers and what that means for New Zealand access for our products. So we're going to keep pushing for that kind of agreement. The negotiations are continuing, just as they are with the EU. But, I think where the Australians are heading might be a slightly different type of agreement than the one that we're trying to get.
Employment number today, what is it?
Yeah, don't know. Don't get told that. I find out at the same time as everyone else does from Stats New Zealand. I said at the time that we had the 4.9 number last quarter that I expected there to be a bit more volatility. Things remain pretty uncertain. This is the March quarter. It covers the period where we had a couple of those shutdowns up in Auckland. So, let's expect the numbers to bobble around a bit for the next little while. But relatively speaking, OECD average is in the sixes. We're at 4.9 at the moment. We'll see what today comes, but New Zealand still, relatively speaking, has done well in terms of where we thought we were going to be on employment and unemployment.
CoreLogic numbers out yesterday. They say the first signs of the housing market slowing. You own that?
Oh, I think it's never going to be one thing. We always talk about the fact that there is no silver bullet. Obviously, we've had the impact of both the real impact of LVRs and the predicted impact of LVRs, plus the policy changes that we announced as well. This will take time again to wash through the system. But clearly, anecdotally, what we're hearing from a lot of people is that some of the investors are backing off from that, that there are, slightly different levels of demand in some areas. Ultimately, the exercise here was to cool things down, to shift the balance towards first-home buyers over the coming months. I think we will see that, but it isn't going to be an instant thing.
Warren Buffett sees inflation, Yellen sees inflation and increasing interest rates. What happens if we don't get growth, but we do get inflation and interest rates have to move?
Yeah, again, a lot of what-ifs in that question, Mike. I mean, clearly a number of people are saying that they believe that we are going to see a return to some inflation. Most of the forecasts I'm seeing still see that level of inflation well and truly within the band that the Reserve Bank worked towards. So, that's not unexpected when we've been so low that we will see some of that coming through. How does it flow through to interest rates? Again, different views coming from people. But, at the moment, we've still got very good prospects for growth in our economy. All of the international agencies, rating agencies, IMF and others can see that. And so I don't think all of the what-ifs in your question are going to come to pass. From a budget perspective, the way that we manage this is that we are careful and balanced. Yep, we will invest in the things that need to be invested in, but it's the reason why we don't, continue to go on endlessly with debt at the levels that it's at now. We start to bring that down from the middle of the decade because that's the right and responsible thing to do.
Given what was said in Parliament last night, how can you still defend Mallard?
Well, look, to be honest with you, Mike, I was actually working away on the budget last night, and so I didn't hear all of the things that were said. There were certainly things said in Parliament from the reporting I've heard this morning that are the subject of parliamentary privilege, so I'm not going to comment on that. From the perspective of the government, of Labor, Mr Mallard apologised for the comments he'd made previously. He did that before last night. Last night was the annual review debate where, the Speaker acts as effectively a minister for the Parliament. He was subject to questioning. He answered those questions, but in terms of the substantive issue, he's apologised for that previously, and from our point of view, that's where the matter rests.
Appreciate your time as always. Grant Robertson, Minister of Delivery, Minister of Finance.
New Zealand, the land of milk and honey and the country. Join Jamie Mackay and Rowena Duncan weekdays from 12 as they survey the rural landscape. All the big issues affecting you. Listen and follow on iHeartRadio or wherever you get your podcasts. News Talk ZB.